You were hurt, badly, in ways that changed you fundamentally, and you survived. You built your entire identity around that survival. Your trauma became your story. Your story became your truth. Your truth became your identity. And everyone around you reinforced it. You're a survivor. Look how strong you are. Your trauma made you who you are. And you believed them. Because it felt true. Because acknowledging your pain felt like honoring yourself. Because turning your wound into wisdom felt like purpose. So you wore your trauma like a badge. You explained yourself through it. You understood yourself through it. You became your trauma, and everyone called it healing. But what if healing isn't becoming your trauma? What if it's the opposite? If this question makes you uncomfortable, stay with me. Here's what nobody tells you about trauma identity. The moment you make your trauma your identity, you stop being human and start being a story, a narrative, a lesson, a cautionary tale. And the problem with being a story is that stories have plots. They have character arcs. They have endings. And once you've written yourself as the traumatized one, every new experience gets filtered through that lens. Someone is kind to you. You wait for them to hurt you because that's what people do in your story. You achieve something? You attribute it to your trauma making you strong. You're happy? You feel guilty because happiness doesn't fit your narrative. Your trauma wasn't just something that happened to you. Now it's something you happen through. It's become the lens through which you see everything, and you defend this lens violently. And here's the trap. The moment you identify as traumatized, every boundary you set becomes justified. Every distance you create becomes healing. Every conversation you avoid becomes self-protection. Every relationship you sabotage becomes necessary. Because you're not being difficult. You're being triggered. You're not being controlling. You're being cautious. You're not being cruel. You're being realistic about people. Your trauma becomes the permission slip for everything. The explanation for your behavior. The reason you don't have to try. The excuse that nobody can question. You don't understand my trauma. End of conversation. That's my trauma response. End of accountability. Your trauma isn't a valid excuse. Suddenly, you're the victim twice. Once by what happened. Once by people not honoring your explanation. And you've made it impossible for anyone to get close to you. You've made trauma your gatekeeper. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sometimes people trigger you and it's just them being annoying. Sometimes you're anxious and it's not a flashback. Sometimes you're sad and it's not related to what happened to you. Sometimes you're just a regular person having a regular bad day. But you can't accept that. Because if your reaction isn't about your trauma, then what is it about? If your behavior isn't a trauma response, then you're just choosing to be difficult. And that's intolerable. So you dig deeper into the trauma narrative. You find connections that weren't there. You manufacture triggers from neutral events. You convince yourself that your overreaction is understandable given what you've been through. You've become so committed to the identity that you've stopped examining whether your reactions are actually proportional. You've stopped asking, is this real or am I performing trauma now? And slowly, without you noticing, you start performing trauma instead of experiencing it. You tell your trauma story so perfectly that you've memorized it. You know which parts get sympathy, which parts get anger, which parts get you space, which parts get you attention. You've optimized your suffering for maximum impact. Your trauma becomes your currency, the thing you trade for understanding, for patience, for forgiveness, for not having to take responsibility. And here's the dark part. Everyone enables it. Your therapist nods and validates. Your friends perform solidarity. Your family walks on eggshells. Your partner accommodates endlessly. Because nobody wants to be the person who doesn't understand trauma. So they accept your narrative without question. They accept your behavior as explained. They accept that you're broken and can't be fixed. And you accept their acceptance as proof that you are, in fact, unfixable. Your trauma has become, your identity has become your destiny. How much of your identity is actually about your trauma versus about who you want to be? So what does this cost you? Everything. You stop growing because growth requires risk. You stop loving because love requires vulnerability beyond your trauma. You stop trying because trying means you might fail, and that would be your trauma's fault. You've given your past trauma the power to determine your future. You've made your wound into a life sentence. People want to connect with you, but they can't because you're not actually present. You're defended. You're explaining yourself before they've even asked. You're preemptively rejecting them before they can reject you. You're so busy protecting yourself from a past that's already happened that you're not actually living in the present that's happening now. Your trauma was real. What happened to you mattered. But the person it happened to isn't who you are now. That person doesn't exist anymore. You're someone else. Someone new. Someone who's been shaped by what happened but isn't defined by it. Let me say this clearly. Some of your suffering is a choice now, not the original trauma. That wasn't your choice. But everything you've done since then to maintain that identity, that's been a choice. You've chosen to tell that story over and over until you believed it completely. You've chosen to reject help because accepting help means admitting you might recover. You've chosen to sabotage relationships that could have healed you because healing relationships doesn't fit your narrative. You've chosen to stay small and broken because that's the only version of yourself you know how to be. And yes, that's understandable given what you've been through. Yes, it makes sense that you'd protect yourself that way. Yes, your trauma explains it, but understanding doesn't change the fact that it's a choice. And that's actually good news, because if it's a choice, you can choose differently. You can choose to not be your trauma. But first, you have to admit that you've been choosing to be. Try this now. Imagine waking up tomorrow and nobody knowing about your trauma. Not your therapist. Not your friends. Not your family. Nobody. You're just a person. What changes? If nothing changes about who you are or how you behave, then your trauma wasn't actually controlling you. You were. But if everything changes, if you suddenly act differently, if you're suddenly happier, suddenly more open, suddenly more willing to try things, then you know that you've been performing trauma. You know that you've been using it as permission to live small. And here's the scariest part. You know that this means you're responsible. You can't blame your past anymore. You can't explain your present through your history anymore. You have to actually face the question, who am I without this story? And for most people, that question is terrifying. Because the answer is, I don't know. And not knowing is scarier than knowing you're broken. Who would you be without your trauma story? But here's the thing. You have a choice right now. You can keep being your trauma. You can keep extracting meaning from your suffering. You can keep using it to explain everything. You can keep defending it when people challenge it. You can keep building your entire identity around being broken and beautifully shattered. Or you can do something radical. You can admit that you survived something bad and you're still here and that's enough. You don't need to make it mean something cosmic. You don't need to turn it into a superpower. You don't need to integrate it into your identity. You can just be someone who experienced trauma and moved on. You can be someone who got hurt and healed. You can be someone with a past but not possessed by that past. You can be someone whole without needing your wound to be the defining feature of that wholeness. But this choice requires something you might not have. It requires humility. It requires admitting that you've been choosing this identity. It requires saying, I can let this go now. And this moment, this choice to not be your trauma is heavy. Because now you have to live with just being you. Regular you. Without the explanation. Without the excuse. Without the narrative that makes sense of everything. Now you have to take responsibility for your choices. Now you have to admit that some of your behavior isn't trauma response, it's just choice. Now you have to try things without the safety net of, I can't because of what happened to me. Now you have to fail sometimes and not attribute it to your past. Now you have to succeed sometimes and own it instead of crediting your trauma for making you resilient. Now you have to have regular conversations without explaining your triggers. Now you have to be disappointing sometimes without apologizing for it. Now you have to be boring sometimes without making it poetic. And all of this is terrifying because it means you're not special. You're not a beautiful survivor story. You're just a person. And somehow that feels like losing part of yourself. Here's what wholeness actually looks like. It doesn't look like transcending your trauma. It doesn't look like your trauma making you special. It looks like your trauma becoming one part of your story among many parts. You're someone who experienced trauma. You're also someone who's funny. You're someone who's ambitious. You're someone who loves specific people. You're someone who creates things. You're someone who tries and fails and tries again. You're someone who's afraid sometimes. You're someone who's brave sometimes. Your trauma is there, but it's not the center anymore. It's not the lens through which everything is filtered. It's just something that happened. And yes, it changed you. But so did the sunrise this morning. So did the book you read. So did the person who was kind to you. So did your own choices. Your trauma didn't make you who you are. Everything made you who you are, including your trauma, but not limited to it. So here's the final uncomfortable truth. Your trauma is real. What happened to you was real. The pain was real. The damage was real. But you're not the damage. You're not the wound. You're the person who got wounded and is still here. And that's enough. You don't need to be special. You don't need to be a lesson. You don't need to be an inspiration or a cautionary tale or a beautiful tragedy. You just need to be you. A person who experienced something hard and survived it and moved on. And yes, moving on means leaving behind the identity that you built around trauma. It means being nobody special. It means being regular. It means letting your trauma be part of your history. instead of your present. It means accepting that you can heal without keeping your wound open to prove it happened. It means admitting that you're not your trauma anymore, if you ever were. If you were always just a person going through something, not something going through a person. Not your trauma wearing a human shape, just you, and that you is enough. But before you can leave this identity behind, you have to see how it works. The pattern. Person does something mildly inconsiderate. You interpret it through your trauma lens. They're trying to hurt me like I was hurt before. Your nervous system goes into protection mode. You pull away. You're triggered. Your trauma identity is activated. Your therapist validates it. Your friends support you. Your family accommodates you. Everything reinforces that yes, this is real, this person is unsafe, your trauma response was justified. And then next time, your threshold gets lower. Next mildly annoying thing gets interpreted as the same threat. Your nervous system stays activated. Your walls stay up. Your identity gets stronger. Your isolation gets deeper. And you're not healing. You're not protecting yourself. You're practicing trauma. You're rehearsing it. You're writing it so deeply into your identity that it becomes the only story you know how to tell. And every relationship that doesn't survive this pattern is proof that people are unsafe, not proof that your approach is destructive. And this is where you actually have power. This is where you can break the pattern. Not by ignoring your trauma, not by pretending it didn't happen, not by toxic positivity your way past it, but by stopping the cycle of interpretation, by sitting with the discomfort and asking, is this actually a threat or am I interpreting it through trauma? By being willing to be mildly disappointed by people without making it mean they're unsafe. By tolerating being hurt without leaving. By distinguishing between actual danger and emotional discomfort. By accepting that sometimes people will hurt you and you won't die and you'll be okay. By realizing that the original trauma was about what someone did to you, but your current patterns are about what you're doing to yourself. And that's actually good news. Because you can stop doing that. You can choose differently. You can be triggered and not act on it. You can feel activated and still choose connection. You can have a trauma response and not let it determine your behavior. That's what actual healing looks like. Some of you think liberation means not talking about your trauma, that if you stop mentioning it, you've moved on. But that's just repression. That's just hiding. Real liberation is different. Real liberation is being able to acknowledge what happened without it being the entirety of who you are. It's saying, yes, I was hurt. No, I'm not still hurt. It's saying, yes, I have triggers. No, I'm not controlled by them anymore. It's saying, yes, my trauma changed me. No, I'm not grateful for what it taught me. You don't have to find the silver lining. You don't have to extract meaning from suffering. You don't have to become beautiful and broken. You can just acknowledge it happened and move on. And moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without identification. It means having a past that doesn't determine your future. It means being someone who experienced something without that experience being the sum total of who you are. And then comes the part you're actually afraid of. Real connection. Because when you're not leading with trauma, people don't know they're supposed to treat you carefully. They might say the wrong thing. They might not understand your past. They might hurt your feelings accidentally and not be horrified. They might just be regular with you. And that's terrifying. Because without the trauma explanation, you have to just be a person being rejected or hurt or disappointed. You have to feel that without making it cosmic. You have to be okay sometimes and not okay sometimes and not have it all mean something about your worth. You have to let people get close without them signing up to manage your triggers. You have to be vulnerable without it being a story about being a survivor. And some people will leave. And it won't be because you're broken. It'll just be because they're not right for you. And you'll be able to accept that without it confirming your fear that everyone abandons you. Here's what you actually get when you stop being your trauma. You get to figure out who you actually are. Not who your trauma made you. Not who you became in response to what happened. But who you actually are underneath all of that. And that's harder than being your trauma. Because your trauma came with an explanation. Your trauma came with meaning. Your trauma came with a community of people who understood. But your actual self? Your actual self is just regular. You like certain things. You're good at certain things. You're bad at other things. You're funny or not funny. You're ambitious or satisfied or somewhere in between. You have values and flaws and contradictions. You're not a beautiful tragedy. You're a person. And that feels boring. Until you realize boring is actually freedom. Boring is actually the space where real life happens, where real connections form, where real growth occurs, where you can be loved for who you are, not for how inspiring your survival story is. This middle ground isn't spiritual transcendence. It's not toxic positivity. It's not healing yourself through positive thinking. It's just honesty. Your trauma happened. It sucked. It was bad. It changed you. And you're still here. And you don't need to make it mean something profound. You don't need to turn it into a superpower. You don't need to credit it with your resilience. You could just be resilient because you chose to keep trying. You could be empathetic because you decided people matter. You could be creative because you like making things, not because pain made you artistic. You could be anything you want that has nothing to do with what was done to you. And some days you'll wake up and your trauma will still be there. You'll still have triggers. You'll still have patterns. You'll still have nervous system responses. But they won't define your day. They'll just be part of your day. Like the weather. Like a bad night's sleep. Like a frustrating person. Bothersome but not determining. Real healing doesn't look like becoming special. Real healing looks like your life mattering without it needing to be justified by your suffering. It looks like friendship without deep conversations about your past. It looks like love without someone needing to understand your triggers. It looks like your accomplishments belonging to you, not to your resilience. It looks like your failures being about you trying, not about your trauma preventing success. It looks like ordinary happiness. Regular contentment, boring peace. It looks like getting hurt and recovering and not writing a song about it. It looks like being disappointed and moving on without analyzing what it means about your safety. It looks like asking yourself, what do I actually want instead of what am I healing from? It looks like building towards something instead of recovering from something. It looks like living instead of surviving. And that's the goal. Not to be a trauma survivor, but to be someone who survived trauma. Someone who moved on. Someone who built something new with their life. Someone ordinary. Someone free. So here's the final truth. Your trauma is real. What happened to you was real. The impact was real. The pain was real. But you are not your trauma. You are someone who experienced trauma and is still here. That's enough. You don't need to build your entire identity around it. You don't need to keep reopening the wound to prove it happened. You don't need to perform your suffering to validate your experience. You don't need to stay broken to honor what broke you. You can acknowledge it, accept it, integrate it as part of your story without letting it be your entire story. You can be someone with a history without being a product of that history. You can move forward without leaving yourself behind. You can heal without needing your wound to be the most important thing about you. And yes, there will be days when the trauma comes back up. Days when you're triggered. Days when old patterns resurface. That's normal. That's part of being human. But those days don't define your whole life anymore. They're just days, and you survive them. Not because your trauma made you strong, but because you choose to keep going. Every day. That's the real strength. That's the actual resilience. That's the only identity that matters. Not trauma survivor. Just survivor, just you. And that you is enough.